16. Religion, Reality or Substitute. Most of this essay was originally printed in World Dominion, Volume 19, September-October 1943. But Paragraph 4 and part of Paragraph 9 were added some years later. It was published in Christian Reflections by Geoffrey Bless in 1967 and is now in the Fount edition 1998. Hebrews chapter 10 verse 1. The law having a shadow of good things to come. We are all quite familiar with this idea that the old Jewish priesthood was a mere symbol, and that Christianity is the reality which it symbolized. It is important, however, to notice what an astonishing, even impudent claim it must have seemed as long as the Temple of Jerusalem was still standing. In the temple you saw real sacrifice being offered. Real animals really had their throats cut, and their actual flesh and blood were used in the ritual. In Christian assemblies, a ceremony with wine and bits of bread was conducted. It must have been all but impossible to resist the conviction that the Jewish service was the reality and the Christian one a mere substitute. Wine is so obviously a substitute for blood and bread for flesh. Yet the Christians had the audacity to maintain that it was the other way round, that their innocuous little ritual meal in private houses was the real sacrifice, and that all the slaughtering, incense, music, and shouting in the temple was merely the shadow. In considering this, we touch upon the very central region where all doubts about our religion live. Things do look so very much as if our whole faith were a substitute for the real well-being we have failed to achieve on earth. It seems so very likely that our rejection of the world is only the disappointed fox's attempt to convince himself that unattainable grapes are sour. After all, we do not usually think much about the next world till our hopes in this have been pretty well flattened out. And when they are revived, we not infrequently abandon our religion. And does not all that talk of celestial love come chiefly from monks and nuns, starved celibates consoling themselves with a compensatory hallucination? And the worship of the Christ-child, does it not also come to us from centuries of lonely old maids? There is no good ignoring these disquieting thoughts. Let us admit from the outset that the psychologists have a good prima facie case. The theory that our religion is a substitute has a great deal of plausibility. Faced with this, the first thing I do is to try to find out what I know about substitutes and the realities for which they are substituted in general. And I find that I don't know so much as I thought I did. Until I considered the matter, I had a sort of impression that one could recognize the difference by mere inspection, if one was really honest, that the substitute would somehow betray itself by the mere taste, would ring false. And this impression was, in fact, one of the sources from which the doubts I mentioned were drawing their strength. What made it seem so likely that religion was a substitute was not any general philosophical argument about the existence of God, but rather the experienced fact that, for the most of us, at most times, the spiritual life tasted so thin or insipid compared with the natural. And I thought that was just what a substitute might be expected to taste like. But after reflection, I discovered that this was not only not an obvious truth, but was even contradicted by some of my own experience. I once knew two bad boys who smoked secretly and stole their father's tobacco. Their father had cigarettes, which he really smoked himself, and cigars, a great many cigars, which he kept for visitors. The boys liked cigarettes very much better than cigars. But every now and then there would come a day when their father had let his supply of cigarettes get so low that the boys thought the theft of even one or two would inevitably be detected. On such days they took cigars instead, and one of them would say to the other, "I'm afraid we'll have to put up with cigars today." And the other would reply, "Well, I suppose a cigar is better than nothing." This is not a fable I'm inventing, but a historical fact that I can vouch for. And here, surely, we have a very good instance of the value to be attached to anyone's first hasty ideas about a reality and a substitute. To these children, a cigar was simply an inferior substitute for a cigarette, a pialet. And, of course, the boys at that stage were quite right about their own feelings. But they would have become ludicrously wrong if they had therefore inferred that cigars, in their own nature, were merely a kind of makeshift cigarette. On that question, their own childish experience offered them no evidence. They had to learn the answer from quite different sources, or else to wait until their palates were grown up. And may I add the important moral of the story? One of these boys has been permanently punished by a lifelong inability to appreciate cigars. Here is another example. When I was a boy, gramophone records were not nearly so good as they are now. In the old recording of an orchestral piece, you could hardly hear the separate instrument at all, but only a single undifferentiated sound. That was the sort of music I grew up on. And when, at a somewhat later age, I began to hear real orchestras, I was actually disappointed with them, just because you didn't get that single sound. What one got in a concert room seemed to me to lack the unity I had grown to expect, to be not an orchestra, but merely a number of individual musicians on the same platform. In fact, I felt it wasn't the real thing. This is an even better example than the former one, for a gramophone record is precisely a substitute and an orchestra the reality. But owing to my musical miseducation, the reality appeared to be a substitute and the substitute a reality. Substitutes suggest wartime feeding. Well, there too I have an example. During the last war, as at present, we had to eat margarine instead of butter. When I began doing so, I couldn't tell the difference between them. For the first week or so, I would have said, "You may call the margarine a substitute if you like, but it is actually just as good as the real thing." But by the end of the war, I could never again have mistaken one for the other, and I never wanted to see margarine again. This is different from the previous examples, because here I started knowing which, in fact, was the substitute. But the point is that mere immediate taste did not at first confirm this bit of knowledge. It was only after long experience that the margarine revealed itself to my senses as the inferior. But enough of my own experiences. I will turn to a better man, to Milton, and to that scene which I used to think the most grotesque, but now think one of the most profound in Paradise Lost. I mean the part where Eve, a few minutes after her creation, sees herself in a pool of water, and falls in love with her own reflection. Then God makes her look up, and she sees Adam. But the interesting point is that the first sight of Adam is a disappointment. He is a much less immediately attractive object than herself. Being divinely guided, Eve gets over this difficult pons asinorum, and lives to learn that being in love with Adam is more inexhaustible, more fruitful, and even better fun than being in love with herself. But if she had been a sinner, like ourselves, she would not have made the transition so easily. She also would have passed through the stage of finding the real, external lover a second best. Indeed, the region from which this example is drawn illustrates my theme better than almost any other. To the pervert, normal love, when it does not appear simply repulsive, appears at best a mere milk-and-water substitute for that ghastly world of impossible fantasies which have become to him the real thing. But every department of life furnishes us with examples. The ears that are delighted with jazz cannot quite believe that classical music is anything but a sort of vegetarian jazz, to quote my friend Barfield. And great literature seems to vulgar taste at first a pale reflection of the thrillers or triangle dramas which it prefers. From all this, I want to draw the following conclusion. Introspection is of no use at all in deciding which of two experiences is a substitute or a second best. At a certain stage, all those sensations which we should expect to find accompanying the proper satisfaction of a fundamental need will actually accompany the substitute, and vice versa. And I want to insist that if we are once convinced of this principle, we should then hold it quite unflinchingly from this moment to the end of our lives. When a witness has once been proved unreliable, turn him out of the court. It is mere waste of time to go sneaking back to his evidence and thinking, after all, and he did say. If immediate feeling has shown itself quite worthless in this matter, then let us never listen to immediate feeling again. In our criterion between a real and a substituted, satisfaction must be sought somewhere else, then in God's name seek it somewhere else. When I say somewhere else, I am not yet speaking of faith or a supernatural gift. What I mean can be shown by an example. If those two bad boys had really wanted to find out whether their view of cigars and cigarettes were correct, there were various things they might have done. They might have asked a grown-up, who would have told them that cigars were actually regarded as the greater luxury of the two, and thus had their error corrected by authority. Or they might have found out by their own researches, that is, by buying their smokes instead of stealing them, that cigars were more expensive than cigarettes, and thence inferred that they could not, in reality, be a mere substitute for them. This would have been correction by reason. Finally, they might have practiced obedience, honesty, and truthfulness, and waited till an age at which they were allowed to smoke, in which case they would have arrived at a more reasonable view about these two ways of preparing tobacco by experience. Authority, reason, experience. On these three, mixed in varying proportions, all our knowledge depends. The authority of many wise men in many different times and places forbids me to regard the spiritual world as an illusion. My reason, showing me the apparently insoluble difficulties of materialism and proving that the hypothesis of a spiritual world covers far more of the facts with far fewer assumptions, forbids me again. My experience, even of such feeble attempts as I have made to live the spiritual life, does not lead to the results which the pursuit of an illusion ordinarily leads to, and therefore forbids me yet again. I am not now saying that no one's reason and no one's experience produce different results. I am only trying to put the whole problem the right way round, to make it clear that the value given to the testimony of any feeling must depend on our whole philosophy, not our whole philosophy on a feeling. If those who deny the spiritual world prove their case on general grounds, then, indeed, it will follow that our apparently spiritual experiences must be an illusion. But equally, if we are right, it will follow that they are the prime reality, and that our natural experiences are a second best. And let us note that, whichever view we embrace, mere feeling will continue to assault our conviction. Just as the Christian has his moments when the clamour of this visible and audible world is so persistent, and the whisper of the spiritual world so faint that faith and reason can hardly stick to their guns, as I well remember, the atheist too has his moments of shuddering misgiving, of an all but irresistible suspicion that old tales may after all be true, that something or someone from outside may at any moment break into his neat, explicable, mechanical universe. Believe in God, and you will have to face hours when it seems obvious that this material world is the only reality. Disbelieve in him, and you must face hours when this material world seems to shout at you that it is not all. No conviction, religious or irreligious, will of itself end once and for all this fifth columnist in the soul. Only the practice of faith, resulting in the habit of faith, will gradually do that. Have we now got to a position from which we can talk about faith without being misunderstood? For in general, we are shy of speaking plain about faith as a virtue. It looks so like praising an intention to believe what you want to believe in the face of evidence to the contrary. The American, in the old story, defined faith as the power of believing what we know to be untrue. Now I define faith as the power of continuing to believe what we once honestly thought to be true until cogent reasons for honestly changing our minds are brought before us. The difficulty of such continuing to believe is constantly ignored or misunderstood in discussions of this subject. It is always assumed that the difficulties of faith are intellectual difficulties, that a man who has once accepted a certain proposition will automatically go on believing it till real grounds for disbelief occur. Nothing could be more superficial. How many of the freshmen who come up to Oxford from religious homes and lose their Christianity in the first year have been honestly argued out of it? How many of our own sudden temporary losses of faith have a rational basis which would stand examination for a moment? I don't know how it is with others, but I find that mere change of scene always has a tendency to decrease my faith at first. God is less credible when I pray in a hotel bedroom than when I am in college. The society of unbelievers makes faith harder, even when they are people whose opinions on any other subject are known to be worthless. These irrational fluctuations in belief are not peculiar to religious belief. They are happening about all our beliefs all day long. Haven't you noticed it with our thoughts about the war? Some days, of course, there is really good or really bad news, which gives us rational grounds for increased optimism or pessimism. But everyone must have experienced days in which we are caught up in a great wave of confidence or down into a trough of anxiety, though there are no new grounds either for the one or the other. Of course, once the mood is on us, we find reason soon enough. We say that we've been thinking it over. But it is pretty plain that the mood has created the reasons, and not vice versa. But there are examples closer to the Christian problem even than these. There are things, say in learning to swim or to climb, which look dangerous and aren't. Your instructor tells you it's safe. You have good reason from past experience to trust him. Perhaps you can even see for yourself by your own reason that it is safe. But the crucial question is, will you be able to go on believing this when you actually see the cliff edge below you, or actually feel yourself unsupported in the water? You will have no rational grounds for disbelieving. It is your senses and your imagination that are going to attack belief. Here, as in the New Testament, the conflict is not between faith and sight. We can face things which we know to be dangerous, if they don't look or sound too dangerous. Our real trouble is often with things we know to be safe, but which look dreadful. Our faith in Christ wavers not so much when real arguments come against it, as when it looks improbable. When the whole world takes on that desolate look, which really tells us much more about the state of our passions and even our digestion than about reality. When we exhort people to faith as a virtue, to the settled intention of continuing to believe certain things, we are not exhorting them to fight against reason. The intention of continuing to believe is required because, though reason is divine, human reasoners are not. When once passion takes part in the game, the human reason, unassisted by grace, has about as much chance of retaining its hold on truths already gained as a snowflake has of retaining its consistency in the mouth of a blast furnace. The sort of arguments against Christianity which our reason can be persuaded to accept at the moment of yielding to temptation are often preposterous. A reason may win truths. Without faith she will retain them just so long as Satan pleases. There is nothing we cannot be made to believe or disbelieve. If we wish to be rational, not now and then, but constantly, we must pray for the gift of faith, for the power to go on believing, not in the teeth of reason, but in the teeth of lust and terror and jealousy and boredom and indifference, that which reason, authority, or experience, or all three, have once delivered to us for truth. And the answer to that prayer will, perhaps, surprise us when it comes. For I am not sure, after all, whether one of the causes of our weak faith is not a secret wish that our faith should not be very strong. Is there some reservation in our minds? Some fear of what it might be like if our religion became quite real? I hope not. God help us all, and forgive us.